So I'm going to share the screen here. So looking at the flow chart again. So last week we talked about how dukkha arises. So the first noble truth is understanding what dukkha is. And to review, dukkha is a myriad of things that we would label as simple as just general dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness to the extreme of the most powerful kind of suffering one could imagine. And so dukkha encompasses all of that. It's not, and I try to use the word dukkha more often because it's not just suffering. It's all the myriad of things that sort of just make being human difficult. And then once we understand what it is, then we have to understand where it comes from. So that's the second noble truth, and that's what we talked about last week was, where does dukkha arise from? And so this week, we're going to talk about putting an end to dukkha, that there is actually an end to the experience of dukkha. And, if we think about, we have perhaps some pain in our life, and that when we are suffering from pain, whatever kind of pain, it could be, a stubbed toe or recovering from surgery. When we are experiencing the pain, we are aware of the fact that if we didn't have the pain, our life would be more enjoyable. The interesting thing is that when the pain goes away, we rarely pause to appreciate the experience of non-pain, right? How many of you just pick a day and sit down and go, I'm not experiencing any pain anywhere in my body today. Let me appreciate that. Most of us don't do that. And so this is where the third noble truth comes in reminding us that while we experience dukkha, we also are working towards the experience of ending dukkha. But we also should recognize that peace and joy exists at the same time that we are experiencing dukkha. So even when we have pain in our body, we may be focusing on not wanting to experience the pain, but we don't think often about where other parts of our body might not be experiencing pain. Or when the pain does subside, we rarely think about what it's like to experience non-pain. So all of the different range of what we put under the umbrella of dukkha fits within this notion. And the way that we are able to realize what it means to experience dukkha, work towards the extinction of it, and cultivate peace and joy, the best method is meditation and mindfulness. That's the practice that helps us to realize those two things. So if we look at our flowchart for the extinction of dukkha, the task for us here is to experience the extinction of dukkha. And so in order to do that, as the Buddha taught, we would go through the 3 turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. The first turning would be in recognizing that it is possible to end dukkha and cultivate peace and joy. So here's where we get to the good news about our 4 Noble Truths. The first 2, not the greatest of news, because we have to kind of stick our fingers into dukkha and swirl around and figure it all out and get to know it. And that's not always the most pleasant thing. We are usually conditioned to avoid understanding what makes us feel bad and distracting ourselves away from the things that make us feel bad. So usually the first 2 noble truths are kind of a downer. But then we get to the 3rd noble truth, and suddenly we have good news, because we learn that we have a way out. There is a way to change how we experience life. And so in the beginning, to recognize that there is a possibility to end dukkha and cultivate peace and joy, we can first look at our lives right now as it is in this moment and see where we are experiencing some peace and joy in our lives. Most people can find some hint of that. They can look back into their past and connect to a time where they may have found that experience of peace and joy, maybe just having a brief appearance. But if for some reason we just really don't feel that we have experienced that, then we can look towards other people and their experience of peace and joy and begin to understand what it means to experience that through other people. And this is an important part of our practice in Lotus Heart Zen, because as we are part of the Mahayana school, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the practice of Mahayana Buddhism is focused on understanding the truth of who you are, so that you can then turn around and help other people realize the truth. And this is where this kind of action of helping others can be experienced by you, because those wonderful people who have experienced peace and joy in their lives are turning around and offering to share that with you. So that gives you the opportunity to experience what that's like, so that then you can begin to cultivate it in your own life. Though I think there's probably very few of us who have not ever experienced any peace and joy. So fortunately, that is not going to be a widespread problem. So once we recognize that it is possible for us to end dukkha and cultivate peace and joy, then we turn the wheel again and we come to encouraging. And this is that we encourage ourselves to practice the extinguishing of dukkha and the cultivation of joy. So this is where we find our motivation to keep us engaged with the practice. This is where we utilize what we've learned from the first 2 noble truths, so that we can then understand the dukkha that we are facing, that we can look towards the source of that dukkha, and then we begin to realize or put into action out the extinction of dukkha. So what we begin to realize through our encouragement is that we have the opportunity every moment to walk through the doorway into peace and joy. We begin to touch the truth that our life, right here, right now, just as it is a miracle that is not some, described miracle in a book, some, other person's experience, or some, story in the Bible or in the Buddhist tales. This is a miracle that we can touch and breathe, and we intimately experience, because our life is a miracle. And the ways that we can get in touch even more intimately with that miracle is through washing the dishes, taking a walk outside. Really, the experience of anything can be the beginning of the experience of extinguishing dukkha and cultivating peace and joy. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just in recognizing that being alive is the greatest source of peace and joy, the greatest miracle that there is. We also begin to realize that we don't need to suffer for our suffering. And we touched on that, I believe, the first week of our discussion. There's a term called Dukkha Dukkha, which is the idea that because we experience dukkha, we suffer for having experienced dukkha. And that is a self-created dukkha. We just sort of added another layer on top of the original. And when we realize that we can put an end to dukkha, then we realize that suffering for dukkha is unnecessary. And think of the tragedy that comes with someone so deeply suffering because of their experience of dukkha, or because they're caught up by rage, or they're caught up by despair, that they would take their own life, where they would extinguish the miracle they have before them. And this is because they hadn't been shown that even when we are caught up by rage, when we are wallowing and drowning in despair, that peace and joy still lives within them. And so this is why this message is such good news, and why it's so important for us to understand, because this is where we begin the possibility to save people. Not only ourselves, but also saving others. Because when we demonstrate that even at a time like this, where we are caught up in really a humanitarian crossroads, where it seems that everything that is being projected out into the world is all suffering, all dukkha, that peace and joy doesn't exist. And yet we can tap into the fact that peace and joy does live in us. And when we face that, then we are doing just as the Buddha did. in facing our challenges, facing our struggles, and finding a way to transform them. So before we understand what it means to put an end to dukkha, usually what we do is we experience some kind of unpleasant thing, and then we try to run away from it, or we try to chase after more pleasant things, not realizing that even chasing after things that are pleasant creates dukkha. And we tend to get caught up kind of bouncing back and forth between these two things. But what we don't realize is that unpleasant and pleasant, they don't really need to be two different things. At the very least, they're not mutually exclusive. We can face the unpleasant and also have room for the pleasant. Or we can face what's unpleasant and transform that into the compost for future peace and joy. And so if you think back at times where, things were really difficult for you, you went through a hard time, or there was a particular challenge that you struggled with that eventually you overcame, I'm sure most of you would look back at that past event from where you are now and find that by having gone through that unpleasant or challenging experience, you actually learned a lot and may actually have found an improvement in your life. And so that's what it means by turning an unpleasant thing into compost. Because it's not that we want to just keep holding on to that unpleasant thing and, hoping that by holding on to it, we'll learn something and it will, make our life better in the future. But it's actually in looking at it, understanding it, breaking it down, overcoming it. Those are all the processes of composting that unpleasant thing so that in the future, what comes out of it is peace and joy. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about what I mean by peace and joy, because those can be tricky words. A lot of times people will talk about happiness. If you put an end to dukkha, then you will find happiness. And I avoid happiness because happiness is a conditional experience. And some people can have more happiness than other people because they may have less conditions for happiness than another person. But all experiences of happiness are conditional because it's depending on certain causes and conditions that you deem qualifying. If those causes and conditions are met, then you experience happiness. If they are not met, then you don't experience happiness. So trying to build an experience where happiness is constant, that is a setup for great big experience of dukkha, because happiness is always going to come to an end. Even if the thing that we are experiencing that makes us happy continues, at some point, even that happiness will turn into dukkha because we get sick of it, or it's too much and we become numb to it, or we suddenly turn from what we like to now not liking it. And I think I used an example last week where when I worked in a bakery where I decorated cakes, and whenever I made a mistake, I got to eat the cake. But that was fun for a little while, but after a few weeks, I really wasn't interested in eating cake anymore. And for a long time, even after I stopped working there, I didn't really want cake. I think I turned to pies for a while. So the thing that you enjoy, the thing that you believe makes you happy, can also become the thing that makes you unhappy. So I try to avoid using happiness. I try to use joy because joy isn't conditional. And one of the ways you can test that is by the fact that there is no such thing as unjoy. Um, Joy is an experience that comes with seeing the miracle of life, the miracle of reality, and all of its wonderful qualities. And that can happen even in the midst of the deepest, most difficult tragedy that one could experience. Happiness probably not going to break through to those kind of things, but joy is actually the thing that keeps us from losing all hope. Joy is the thing that helps us, that gives us the strength to get to the other side or to transform the suffering that we are experiencing. So another way to look at it is when I'm talking about peace and joy in this context, I'm not talking about the kind of peace and joy you might have when you're out having a fun time. Or maybe you go to a fun social event like a party, and you enjoy yourself and you see other people enjoying themselves, and you think, wow, okay, everybody's experiencing peace and joy. But if you were to look a little deeper, just past the surface of appearances, then you're more likely to find that peace and joy in the deeper sense doesn't go, it doesn't, that experience of peace and joy they may be showing on the outside doesn't go very deep inside. And that's because we tend to distract ourselves from the experience of our unpleasant unsatisfactoriness by wearing the dressing of happiness. And while that's not overall wrong, if that's the only way that we allow ourselves to feel good about our lives, then that can be very hollow. And then you may find that everything is like an a la carte kind of experience where I've got to try this and I got to try that because I got to find a way to keep this happiness, this feeling good alive. And the peace and joy that I'm talking about that comes with the extinction of dukkha is the kind of peace and joy that has always been there. It never went away, even if we don't think we feel it. It's never smothered out. It's never extinguished. It is the substance of what being alive is made of. And so when we experience dukkha and when we work to understand it and embrace that we are experiencing it, only in doing that are we going to find the peace and joy that I'm talking about. That peace and joy, it doesn't come by avoiding our myriad of experiences of dukkha. It doesn't appear when we chase after things to distract ourselves from dukkha. Even though it's there always, it won't reveal itself to us if we don't actually understand where it lives within us. And those times when we feel that it's obscured from us, those are the times where what's calling out to us is the need to transform or compost that dukkha so that we can experience future peace and joy. So when we practice this third noble truth, we begin to realize that the only difference between you and me and a Buddha is that Buddhas know how to transform dukkha into peace and joy. Buddhas don't avoid any kind of dukkha. In fact, Buddhas are often drawn to wherever dukkha appears, and they, like a scientist, get right up in there and study it, touch it, become very familiar with it, and transform it. Because the difference between you and me and a Buddha is that Buddhas understand in a very deep, intrinsic way that dukkha is impermanent, that it doesn't last, that it always changes. And in a deeper, more metaphysical kind of notion, Buddhas understand that suffering or dukkha really doesn't exist at all. So when we are trying to encourage ourselves to practice, it really is, or what I want to say is that we are often most encouraged to practice the extinguishing of dukkha when we are experiencing our most challenging difficulties. And most of us, certainly those of us who are therapists or spiritual mentors, will recognize that most people wake up to the spiritual path when really difficult things happen to them. It's sort of like an invitation to waking up to the truth of what life really is when suffering is at the highest. That's often when we seek to find freedom. If we're lucky, we find the right place that speaks to us, that really shows us the way to that freedom. Sometimes we wake up to wanting to understand that truth and we don't go to the right place, or our intention is to do that, but our will is not quite there yet. And so we may run away again until we need another kind of kick in the butt to really get our will in line with finding that freedom. The challenge when we turn to any kind of spiritual discipline for that sense of liberation is that once we start, we really can't put it down. If we put it down, we just kind of re-enslave ourselves back into the suffering that we were trying to free ourselves from. Sometimes it feels less imprisoning because we try to settle, but it's almost, I like to use the analogy of, like, if you're on a hike and you perhaps partway through you lost your map, but you have a general idea of where to go because there's a path, and you keep walking, and then you get into this part of the path where it's all mucky, really like up to the thigh, thick mud. and it's really hard to walk through. And it's, as far as you can see, it's muck. Uh, um, and you lost your map, so you don't really know how long this muck goes on. And by the time you get about, what feels like halfway through, you stop and you think, do I keep going or do I just stay here? So most people are going to go, all right, I just got to keep going because eventually I know this ends. I don't know when, but I know it ends. But then sometimes we have some stubborn people, or we have a stubborn situation where we decide, no, I'm going to just stay here and wait till the muck goes away. And usually what happens is you stay there and you stay there and you get more and more miserable and probably more angry. And then you start blaming the muck and everything that causes the muck to be there until you realize you got to just keep going. So save yourself the agony, even when it's really difficult. Don't put it down. Keep going, because every challenge we face has an end. We may not be where we think it is, but we all have the ability to transform our suffering and cultivate peace and joy, but it's a gradual process. It can take several turnings of our wheels of dharma to clearly see where the source of our particular suffering arises from. And it may take several turnings before we understand where the peace and joy that's already in us can emerge from. Another example is if our body is sick, we go to the doctor. Hopefully the doctor can help us understand what's causing us to be sick. And if we're able to find the cause of the sickness, the doctor gives us a prescription for how to address the cause. If we only pay attention to the symptoms of our sickness and we just treat the symptoms, then we may never be freed from the illness that's afflicting us. It's following this prescription that addresses the cause is what we need, but also that might not be enough altogether. We might also need to take extra care of the body while it recovers. And we may discover that there are certain habits that we have that aren't so good for the body, which help contribute to the origin of the illness. And that we may also discover there are other habits that are good for our bodies that we should adopt. And we may also find that, if we have to get more exercise, if we call upon friends who want to get more exercise, we can do it together, and it makes it easier for us to adopt those good habits. And so the same kind of analogy, we can apply to this practice of the Four Noble Truths, because one, we have to understand that, we're experiencing dukkha and what that is in our life. Then we have to get to the bottom of it, figure out where it's coming from. And then we have to put into practice the things that end the arising of the origin of dukkha. So it's not, the extinction of dukkha is not treating the symptoms. It's getting to the actual source and putting an end to that. And that's why it's challenging and why the encouragement process is so important, because there are going to be times where we feel like we're stuck in that unending field of muck and we're never going to get out of it. But if we encourage ourselves, if we put together the prescription that helps us to adopt the good habits, to find ways to cultivate peace and joy, and whether that's sharing peace and joy with others or sharing in others' peace and joy, then we can get through those more difficult times where it seems like it's just unending. Or what I hear most commonly, and I know I'm one who certainly experiences that, which is one suffering or one kind of dukkha after another. You know, it's like this happens, and then this happens, and then the other thing happens, and they all happen within a short space of time, and it just seems unrelenting and the impossible to get through. And yet somehow we get through it, and if we're lucky, we have a period of ease where we can enjoy not having so much suffering. But then, something else is going to happen until we learn how to completely extinguish the origin of dukkha altogether. And that's where we come to the realization, the last turning. And that's that dukkha has been extinguished and peace and joy is present. And so it's through our efforts, through our motivation, through our understanding of dukkha and the cultivation of peace and joy that we are able to realize the third noble truth. And that's, we have dukkha. When we look deeply at dukkha, we see that there is an origin to dukkha. And with the understanding of the origin of dukkha, we see that there is an end. We realize then that we are practicing the extinction of dukkha and the cultivation of peace and joy. And the key word here is practicing. It's not about memorizing an affirmation to help us feel good. It's not about understanding how things, it is about understanding how things really are. And the only way we can understand how things really are is through the practice, because it's through the practice that we see our life emerge. The Buddha said, "Bhikkhus, whoever sees dukkha sees the making of dukkha, the ending of dukkha, and the path that leads to the end of dukkha. Whoever sees the making of dukkha sees dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the path. Whoever sees the ending of dukkha sees dukkha, the making of dukkha, and the path. Whoever sees the path that leads to the end of dukkha sees dukkha, the making of dukkha, and the ending of dukkha." So in the typical Indian style of instruction, what the Buddha is saying here is that it doesn't always matter if we start, or we don't have to just start with the first noble truth, then to go to the second noble truth, then get to the third noble truth, which then leads us to the fourth noble truth, which we'll talk about next week. Sometimes we start with the third noble truth, and that brings us to the first noble truth. And then through the application of the fourth noble truth, we understand the second noble truth. So that's why on this flowchart I didn't number the four noble truths, because that way we don't have to lock ourselves in thinking that we have to go in this orderly fashion. I'm presenting it in that way because it's easier to do, but we don't have to. Everything in our life is not the same prescription. One person headache may require laying down and drinking lots of fluids. another person's headache may require medication. So the same thing can be addressed in different ways, mostly because when we get down to the real root of it, there are different reasons why it's there. So the realization of the extinction of dukkha tells us that it's the dukkha, the experience of the myriad kinds of struggles, sufferings, unsatisfactoriness that we experience in life is the very thing that directs us to practice. Kind of like being stuck in the middle of that muck, that eventually at some point it's being stuck in that muck that tells us we've got to keep going. That I just got to understand this, really get to know it, understand the cause, and put an end to it. And that, in this case, the example being just keep walking and you'll be out of it. If we turn away from dukkha, then we are enslaved by it. So that's pretty much what the Third Noble Truth is about. One last thing I wanted to cover just briefly, because this could be like, you know, a year-long discussion, and I don't want to have that kind of discussion. And that's about nirvana. If you read some of the sutras that elaborate on the Four Noble Truths, oftentimes there will be discussion that the extinction of dukkha results in nirvana. And most people who aren't practiced in Buddhism or even in Hinduism may not have the right understanding of nirvana. And so part of the confusion that comes for Buddhists who are learning about Buddhism is that even within Buddhism, nirvana isn't agreed upon fully. The meaning itself is quite clear in that it means to extinguish, or to, well, like to extinguish in the way of like you blow out a candle. And so nirvana is pointing to something is ending. And the question then becomes, what is it and what happens when it's extinguished? In Theravadan Buddhism, nirvana is looked at as the extinction of dukkha wholly. The whole extinction of dukkha is what leads to nirvana. And the extinction of dukkha means that greed, hate, delusion, all of the things that are associated with what gives rise to dukkha is extinguished. One way to think of it is, we've used this example before of the ocean. And the surface of the ocean, you know, has, you know, this undulation on it. And then one undulation will begin to form above the surface of the ocean. We call that a wave. And as we watch the wave begin to form, we are experiencing an illusion that that wave is made of a single mass of water that's moving over the surface of the ocean, and that that wave is produced and nourished by the wind and maintained by stored up energies after the wind has ceased, and there's no more new wind to activate the surface of the water. those stored up energies will eventually get used up, and the whole undulating motion of that thing we called a wave will end. And so if we don't add fire, or if the fire doesn't get new fuel, it will after a while consume the pre-existing fuel and it will become extinct. That's what nirvana is. We're no longer nourishing the energy that was giving rise to the experience of dukkha. Another example that we would use would be the 5 skandhas. We talked about that on the first noble truth, which is, you know, the coming together of form. Boy, now I have to call on my memory, and it's not working. Form, mental formations, perceptions, volitions or will, and one more thing that I can't think of. The 5 things that come together that make it what we perceive as what it means, or what the experience of being human is. And so if we are experiencing the coming together of these 5 things, but we are completely ignorant of the fact that what we feel as individual separate personhood is being experienced, and we continue to nourish this idea that we have this separate personhood by craving and maintaining all of the energies that come with, you know, feeding this notion of a separate permanent personhood existing. After a while, the fuel that we are using that feeds the craving and the clinging to life ends, and we no longer are putting new fuel in. Then at some point, the body, those 5 parts that come together, will begin to fall apart. So most often it's going to be the body, the form stops functioning, and then all the other parts that come together, which makes it feel what it is to be human, falls apart, and we are extinguished. With the Theravadan view of nirvana, there are 2 aspects. One, the extinction that comes with no longer giving rise to the impurities, which would be all of the things that we think of as greed, anger, hatred, depression, despair, all of those kind of things are no longer nourished. And if that happens during one's lifetime, they realize nirvana, which means that they're still alive, but they are no longer conditioned by dukkha. Then there's another aspect, which is the extinction of the 5 skandha process, which means that at the death of the person who has realized nirvana, the body falls apart and they enter what we call skandha parinirvana, which means that they will not return back to the world of birth and death, or the samsaric cycle. They are now exempt from it and they won't return. And so they won't ever experience dukkha or the limitations of a body, a mind, all those things. Oh, that's the fifth one, mind, thought. So Mahayana Buddhists have a different view of nirvana. So Theravadins are, their practice is geared towards enlightenment or awakening, realized through their practice. And that's usually the ultimate aim. And also to facilitate that, it's usually focused on getting rid of negative karma, and so that each rebirth into the world puts them at a higher place. That means eventually, hopefully sooner than later, they no longer are subject to birth and death. Mahayana Buddhists focus on becoming a bodhisattva over becoming a awakened person in this lifetime, what we call an arhat in the Theravadan tradition. So first, the goal is realize nirvana, but before fully embracing nirvana, we're going to turn away and go back and help a whole bunch of other people realize nirvana. And that's what we call bodhisattva. Then after that's done, after they've turned around and saved, however number of people is deemed necessary, they then become a Buddha. And when the Buddha realizes nirvana, then it's a whole different game. Then Buddhas can pretty much go wherever they want. But they don't have to be, they're no longer caught in the cycle of samsara. So with the Mahayana view, and again, there are many different Mahayana schools that hold many different ideas about the realization of nirvana. But for the most part, you can break it down to two different kind of views. One is that one remains in the cycle of samsara and help other beings awaken until they reach that, the millionth customer, and whatever number that qualifies them to become a Buddha or a bodhisattva. Then they would then move into the next level of realizing nirvana, which be to become a Buddha. And then after becoming a Buddha, they realize nirvana or fully, embrace the realization of nirvana. And then they stop their cycle of birth and death. Or the realization of nirvana is not postponed, but then there are two different kinds of nirvana that are to be realized. The first one would be the pradashita nirvana, and that's the nirvana realized by an individual and considered the lesser form of nirvana. And then the second kind of nirvana, which is called apratishita nirvana, which is considered the highest attainment, and that's the type of nirvana realized by a Buddha. So you're going to hear all kinds of different nirvana meanings and ways of realizing nirvana. Who knows which is the right one? But generally, if you are practicing within the Mahayana school, the latter two, the focus on the type of nirvana realized as a bodhisattva, and then the type of realization that a Buddha has, slightly different kinds of nirvana. The simple, straightforward answer for what nirvana is that it's simply the end of all formations, ideas, notions. So birth, the notion of birth is a concept. Death also is a concept. Being, non-being, these are all concepts. And every day in our lives, we face the realities of being part of the relative world. But if we only live at the surface of the relative world, where the concepts are all there are, then we are snared by, enslaved by, we are caught by dukkha. For those of you who practice with Lotus Heart Zen or practice on their own, there's a famous sutra called the Heart Sutra, which is widely practiced by Mahayana Buddhists. And the Heart Sutra points us towards viewing life more deeply than just the surface level of formations, ideas, concepts. And it's not about understanding a new kind of concept. And that's the tricky thing about understanding nirvana, because nirvana is not a concept to be understood intellectually. Nirvana is a word that describes a process or a experience of realization. And that's why I think the use of the word meaning in Sanskrit to blow out is good, because it's telling us two things. One, that it requires engagement. You know, it's not blown out. It's not that it's already out. It's that it must be actively blown out, and that the blowing out ends the process. So when we in our minds make the ideas of birth, death, being, non-being extinct, that we no longer keep them lit, when we no longer cling to these words and ideas as real, separate things, then the cause of our dukkha, the origination of our dukkha, ceases to exist. So the kinds of things that we do in our lives, why not wanting impermanence equals suffering, believing that we are separate from all other things equals suffering, limiting our view to only the relative dualistic world equals suffering, also limiting our view to only the absolute equals suffering. So we have to extinguish the objects of clinging, extinguish the clinging itself. And when we do that, we understand nirvana. In Zen, in particular, we talk a lot about destroying all concepts of entering don't know, or beginner's mind, or just this. And when we experience those states, then we understand nirvana. Understanding nirvana means experiencing nirvana. It is the experiencing in that moment, when it's devoid of concepts, ideas, or notions, that we enter nirvana. And so the common misconception of nirvana is that it's a destination, like a heaven, that after we die, we go to this place called nirvana. And it's not something that we reach out for. It's not a rock band. It's not another kind of heaven. It's not even tomorrow or next week. Nirvana exists right here, right now, and it's accessible to everyone and all. What's interesting is nirvana is this, tends to be sort of this goal that practitioners have in their mind of realizing. And what we don't realize when we put it into that context is that we're already what we're seeking to become. We don't have to reach out for anything. We don't need to chase after anything. We can stop running altogether. Just stop. All we do is stop and turn to yourself, get in touch with your true nature. And when you touch that true nature, that's where you touch peace and joy that's always present. The Buddha said, my practice is non-action, non-practice, non-realization. So we don't seek outside of ourselves. All that we need to know is inside. So, to be continued. Next week, we'll talk about the fourth noble truth, which is the path leading to the extinction of dukkha. And you might want to add a little subheading without saying, and the path that leads to peace and joy. So we'll explore that. And that, most of you will know, includes the Eightfold Path. And so we'll cover what that is all about. So that is the end of my presentation. Are there any questions?
Could you say Nirvana is peace and joy?
Well, in some ways, as long as the is meant in an active sense, the challenges with Nirvana, and the Buddha kind of addressed this challenge by talking mostly about what Nirvana wasn't, because it's kind of hard to describe something that someone who can't see past the delusions of dukkha and their own enslavement of their ignorance. How do you describe something that they have no experience in, right? So he would talk more about what Nirvana wasn't, because you could kind of strip away the things that you know. And then whatever's left is kind of like, oh, then maybe it's somewhere in there. I've heard it talked about, and I kind of liked this notion, because one of the things that, especially with the West, people are always trying to find a way to bring Buddhism in with Christianity. And so that's partly why the confusion over Nirvana being sort of like heaven, I think, kind of took hold, because it's similar in the sense that you talk about this peace and bliss and things like that. But the difference is that it's an active thing that is taking place because of practice, because of how you are engaging with life as it's appearing. So I've heard before, and I really like this analogy, that if you wanted to bridge Buddhism and Christianity, then Nirvana would be more like what God is. So that, because when you talk about God, you talk about an active process, right? God is peace, God is love, God is bliss, and Nirvana is the same thing. So if you think of God as being sort of the ground of all being, then Nirvana is like that also. And so it's a realization that one has that is made by peeling away all of the layers of things that we've added. And so then once that's gone, we're right back where we started. And in some ways, I hear people talk about God in similar ways, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
Well, no, it made sense to me because when I practiced Christianity, I would always think that I had a God voice inside me that was probably like my true self that was telling me you shouldn't do this or this isn't good for you. And sometimes I would listen, but sometimes I would be too afraid to listen. So I can see that.
yeah, I mean, that's, I think, what we refer to when we say we make contact with our true nature, right? Um, and I think, honestly, I think that we all, for flashes of a moment, touch that realization of nirvana. But it's like we shut it right down because sometimes we don't understand what it is. Sometimes it frightens us.
Mm.
Um, and sometimes we just don't notice it. You know, it's so fast and sudden. It, it doesn't mean we don't experience it. Just like the fact that right now, every one of us is, able to realize nirvana just like that if we, you know, stop trying to hold on to concepts and ideas as real and, refuse to accept that all things are impermanent, that there is no separate independent self-existence, and that uh, we are experiencing uh, the cycle of birth and death, which gives rise to suffering or dukkha. Just like that. You just do it.
Okay.
I think it gets easier. And one of the things that's interesting too is, teaching this isn't about, you know, okay, you're going to hear it and then tomorrow you're going to do it. Well, tomorrow you can put it into practice, but the realization, the ultimate realization we think of as, enlightenment. I like to say awakening. Uh, that happens gradually, um, which that can open up into a whole other uh, uh, talk as well, because in the Chinese and Korean Buddhism, there was a whole, kind of division around whether practice led towards gradual awakening or sudden awakening. Um, and I think the truth is that the real, good night, John, the real, the, the real truth is that it's both. It's gradual and sudden, because even the sudden awakening came about because of the gradual cultivation.
Right.
You know, it's not like you're born, you are a baby, you don't have any words yet, you're put down on grass, you feel the grass, and you're like, aha, I've awakened. That would be sudden awakening, but no, I think we have to do the gradual first, and then the sudden comes. And then for some of us, it's gradual, sudden, then we go back to gradual and back to sudden. That's kind of more like me, I think. Um, any other questions? Well, next Tuesday, same time, 7 o'clock, we'll finish this series of talks. And I'm going to be shifting gears after next week. And I think I'm going to be doing some presentations about ahimsa and the practice of ahimsa. People in the Sangha we'll be getting some more in-depth practice in that, with the hopes that then we can do bigger workshops with more people. But I didn't want to leave everybody in the dark. I think it's also good for all of us, rather than like in the, what I talked about tonight, rather than keep treating symptoms. All these different issues that we are, bombarded with every day, if it's women's rights or environmental rights or Native American rights or Black people's rights. For the most part, addressing those things is just addressing the symptoms. And I want to address the source. And I think by learning how to practice ahimsa, that's addressing the source, which is, for those of you who don't know, ahimsa means non-harm. So how do we practice non-harm in our life? And hopefully people will see that it takes care of a lot of symptoms and origins of the causes of those symptoms. So I'll be working on that probably the week after next. So I will send out more information as that comes about. And one last thing, if you go to the website, Lotus Heart Zen, under our practice section, I've put up videos. If you're on Facebook, I've also put them up there. I now have the videos for the Pure Land talks and the first two of the Four Noble Truth talks. And you can watch those from the website through YouTube. It took me a while to figure out how to get those up there and loaded, and hopefully they all work fine. I tested part of them, but I didn't really want to listen to myself talk. So it started anyway. So if there's any problems, let me know. And in the meantime, have a good night. And if you're free, sign in tomorrow. I'm going to do a guided meditation, something relaxing and peaceful, I hope. And I hope to see you all then.
Thank you.
Have a
Yes,
good
thank
night.
you. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Be well, everyone.